Okay, hello everybody. My name is Bhuvia Yulin and I am the director for SCMA. Welcome to today's webinar, Race and Caste, Gender and Patriarchy, Wealth and Class, Mediating the System, Structures, and Sources of Prejudice with Ken Cloke. This webinar is in meeting format, so you can hear and see us, and we can hear and see you. So we ask that you please mute yourself. This virtual event is also being recorded and will be made available to all those who registered sometime next week. If you have any general questions regarding the event, please feel free to send me a message or a chat, or you can always send us an email at info@scmediation.org. I will now turn it over to Jennifer Johnson-Toronto.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Toronto. I am one of the co-chairs of programming for SCMA, and I am so pleased to introduce the sponsor of today's program, Kim Best, RN, mediator, author of How to Live Forever, a guide to writing the final chapter of your life, and a past guest on the SCMA How I Made It series, which I highly recommend you're checking out if you haven't had the opportunity to view that yet. Kim, thank you so much for sponsoring this highly anticipated event. And I will turn the screen over to you for a moment to say hello.
Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be back again. I wanted to thank you all somehow for hosting me last month. I met the nicest people and had a great time. So I reached out to Bouvier and she said, well, how would you like to sponsor Ken Cloke's talk? And I'm terribly excited to do that and honored to do that because that means I'm like the opening act for Ken Cloke. So that's how I know I made it in mediation. So I don't want to take up any time, but thank you all for having me back again.
Thank you, Kim. And I'm sorry if I wasn't on screen. I just realized I had to adjust my screen. But again, Kim, on behalf of SCMA, thank you so much for sponsoring this program. And please allow me to introduce SCMA's President-elect, Richard Earhart.
Thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate it and a pleasure to be here. This is very exciting. And as Jennifer said, a highly anticipated event today featuring Ken Cloke. And Ken, in addition to being a mediator, arbitrator, facilitator and coach, consultant and trainer, Ken is more than anything else, in my opinion, a peacemaker. He is a friend to everyone in this profession who gives up of his time and expertise freely. His accomplishments are actually too numerous to mention here today, but because of these accomplishments, he is an inspiration to all of us. And as Kim Best and I were discussing right before we started the webinar this morning or this afternoon, Ken Cloke is someone that we would like to be when we both grow up. So, anything else would give you Ken Cloke. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Richard, and Kim and Bouvier and Jennifer and everyone who has helped to make this happen. Let me just say by way of opening that you have probably now received the materials that Bouvier sent out to you. Fundamentally, there is an article that I have written on this topic that explores it in a little bit greater depth. And there are also some PowerPoint slides. Both of those now belong to you. If there's anything in those PowerPoint slides that you would like to use with someone else, you're welcome to use them. You're also welcome to modify them and improve them. And hopefully you will do that. Let me also say, by way of introduction to this topic, that these issues are incredibly complex, difficult, dangerous, divisive, highly conflicted topics, which makes them difficult to talk about. But the second point is that these issues, excuse me, matter. They make an enormous difference in all of our lives. And it's difficult actually for us to imagine what it might be like to live in the absence of prejudice and bias, because we're so surrounded by it that it takes some movement to some completely different environment to just jog us into awareness of the fact that we have been living with a problem constantly. And unless we are the ones who are directly impacted by that problem, that is, we fit into some category of people who are prejudiced or biased against, it's possible to just kind of slip into a state of just a pretense and illusion around it. So what we want to do instead, and our goal for today, is to look at these topics with the perspective of mediators and dialogue facilitators, collaborative negotiators, conflict resolvers. A second point, we have been talking separately and superficially, really what I would say around these topics in the US for at least 400 years, or nearly 400 years, but we have rarely had conversations together. We've rarely talked about them deeply, and we have almost never spoken about them successfully or talked our way through them. So as a result of this, every conversation that we have about bias or prejudice is one in which we are bound to make mistakes and even trigger conflicts that can discourage us from even trying to make things better or trying to talk about them in the future. So, but in order to find our way through them, or rather, let's put it slightly differently, in order to find our way out, we have to find a way through. And none of us, no matter what our expertise or background, can do this alone. We have to do this together. Two of the ways that we have of approaching these issues together from the perspective of our professional experience are dialogue and mediation. But we have not yet, as a profession, figured out how to use these skills to resolve conflicts over bias and prejudice and stereotyping and discrimination effectively. So that's really what we are here to talk about. How exactly do we do this? And what I would like to do also before really launching into the subject is to invite your responses. I think we need to have much more time than just an hour to do this. I really want to thank SCMA and Richard in particular for his leadership in inviting us to spend some time looking at this incredibly important, incredibly difficult topic. But we need to do a lot more. We need to have many more conversations. And I have also asked the leadership of SCMA to let me know if there are any questions that are pressing that you want to ask. There will be ample time at the end for conversation, but I'd like to invite you to put any questions or comments or issues that you would like to raise in the chat box. And I'm hoping that those chats will then be recorded and perhaps emailed out to everyone so we can all have the benefit of our collective wisdom on this subject. In order to have a little bit better understanding of the topic, we need to stop for a moment and think about the issues of prejudice and bias, stereotyping, and discrimination. And when we first think about these issues, we think of racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, all of these various forms of prejudgment. And at the very beginning of our understanding of these issues, we can label all of these as conflicts. So initially, that's an opening for mediators and an invitation to think about these topics as conflicts and to bring the expertise and all of the years of experience that we have relating to conflicts to these particular kinds of conflicts, and then to figure out what it is that works and what doesn't. So we can think of bias and prejudice as a kind of adversarial attitude towards differences, towards diversity. And we can also then understand that this is something that we commonly experience in conflict. That is, the differences between spouses can become adversarial, hostile, aggressive. More broadly than that, we can see that prejudice, bias, stereotyping have a kind of trigger, a kind of point of origin in our neurophysiological responses to perceived threats. And so we have to think about how it is that our neurophysiology gets us into trouble, and what we can do at a neurophysiological level to shift that response in a different direction. So here are 2 points. One, it is possible to understand that prejudice, bias, stereotyping, discrimination are simply elementary aspects of ordinary conflict responses that are present, often in miniature, in every conflict. Do we prejudge our opponents? And I think the answer is yes. Do we have biases that we form against people in the workplace without regard to race or gender or any of these other categories? Do we have biases against them as a result of the conflicts that we have experienced with them? And the answer is yes. So there are 2 possible conclusions we can come to as we begin to approach this topic. First, we can use conflict resolution techniques to reduce bias and prejudice. Not completely, not in every aspect, but certainly in their aspect as conflicts. And second, and more interestingly, I think for us as practitioners, we can incorporate into conflict resolution the techniques and ideas that we have developed in responding to bias and prejudice. That is, it's possible for us to learn in both directions how to handle these issues in a better way. So now what I would like to do is to take a look at an interesting idea that was given to us by a really brilliant writer whose name is Isabel Wilkerson. Isabel Wilkerson won the Pulitzer Prize for a book that she wrote about kind of Black migration during the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. But she wrote another book, which is called Caste. And what she does in that book is to look at the issue of race from a different perspective. And for me, that is a kind of introduction into some of the issues that we are facing in connection with thinking about these problems. And let's see, I think I'm going to share my screen here. Oh, let's see, can I do this? Yeah, here we go. I'm going to share my screen here for a moment and bring up a couple of quotes from Isabel Wilkerson, which are in the article and in the materials. Unfortunately, I'm just going to just show this. I'm not going to do a slideshow because it tends to crash PowerPoint for me for some reason. Here's what she writes. Caste is the granting or withholding of respect, status, honor, attention, privileges, resources, benefit of the doubt, and human kindness to someone on the basis of their perceived rank or standing in the hierarchy. Caste is insidious and therefore powerful because it is not hatred. It is not personal. It is the worn grooves of comforting routines and unthinking expectations, patterns of a social order that has been in place for so long that it looks like the natural order of things. So here's the advantage of this particular perspective. It doesn't diminish or negate the idea of race as being all of those things. What it does is it gives us a way of understanding systemic racism. That is, to recognize that there is not just bias and prejudice at a personal level. There is also a system that is operating beneath the surface that has the ability to regenerate itself. So if we think of systems in general, here is a shorthand definition of a system. It's anything that turns in a circle, that replicates itself. So many of us are now in rooms that have heating units, and the heating unit is a system. It has a thermostat and a heater, and the thermostat detects the temperature in the room, turns the heater on, detects the change in temperature, turns the heater off. So that's a system. It turns in a circle. And the question then becomes, if racism and sexism and all of these other forms of prejudice are systems, what causes them to turn in a circle? How many different levels does this operate on? And here, I think we can begin to approach this now and look at what Isabel Wilkerson has given us as an invitation to apply what we have learned from conflict resolution to conflicts over prejudice and bias and discrimination. How exactly do we do this? Well, if we go back to kind of a basic question in conflict resolution, which is, where do conflicts exist? Where are they located? We can come up with 3 specific answers and 1 general answer that will be helpful to us in thinking about prejudice and bias and stereotyping, etc. Where is the first location? Where is conflict located? First answer, inside of each of us. That is, conflict has a personal location. It is internal. And inside of each of us is a place where biases and prejudices arise, stereotypes are formed, and we begin to have judgments about people based on categories. Now, there is an interesting little piece about this that is worth possibly mentioning. There is something that is interesting about the nature of the human brain, which is that it is only able to create a certain number of relationships that are close. And after we reach that number, what happens is we begin to lump people together into categories. We form them into groups in order to handle their differences. The maximum number of friends, for example, that we are able to have is 150. And after 150, we lump people into categories like friends from high school, friends from college, something of this sort. And we do something similar with regard to people generally. We can lump women and men into separate groups. We can lump people racially, African American, Latino, Asian, white. We can lump people according to class. But this tendency to lump people together is a kind of, it's not exactly prejudice. It's just a form of simplification of complex information. And a lot of this happens neurophysiologically inside of us. Second point, second location of conflict. Conflicts are also located relationally, externally, outside of us. And the that is, they are located between us. So we have conflicts that are personal and conflicts that are interpersonal, conflicts that are internal, conflicts that are relational. And when we move from the internal source of prejudgment or bias, including, we need to add cognitive biases, like those that were identified by Daniel Kahneman in the book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And there are over 100 cognitive biases. If you Google cognitive bias, you'll come up with many, many of them. And of course, the most common one is confirmation bias, which is to confirm what we already believe to be true. Relationally, then, what happens is we act out the internal sources of bias in our relationships with others. Now, it isn't just from internal to external, because the external also impacts us internally. If we have a friend who acts in a certain way towards us, we tend to internalize the lessons that are taught from that experience. The more conflicted that experience, the more those lessons are laid down in the form of warnings. And warnings often take the simple form of biases and prejudices, of lumping people together. A third location of conflict is in the systems that surround us. And here I mean family systems, organizational systems, social, economic, and political systems, belief systems. And the difficulty is, by my way of saying this, is that the system doesn't show up for the mediation. The mediation is between A and B, between Jennifer and Ted. But the system, the organizational structures and expectations and cultures doesn't show up for that mediation. And so we ordinarily pay very little attention to what happens at a systemic level. And yet, because of the fact that it's a system and the system is capable of turning in a circle, that cycle, that systemic cycle, causes us to revisit those conflicts on a chronic basis. We become stuck in a kind of closed loop and recycle prejudices and biases over and over again when they make no sense whatsoever. And I think we have all experienced this, not only externally as we look at others, but in our own lives. We have seen that we have approached people having assumptions about who they are, what they represent. And I think all of us know from mediation that those are obstacles to empathy, to communication, and to understanding. So these are three specific locations in which bias and prejudice have an impact. And it is obvious, I think, that we need to approach them differently, using different techniques. And one of the difficulties with our conversations around racism in this country is that we have been using techniques that are appropriate for one location in some completely different location to tackle a different kind of problem at a different level. So what we need to develop are a much richer set of techniques for addressing bias in all of their locations. And here's what I think Isabel Wilkerson has given us. And I really recommend that you take a look at her book because it's really beautifully written and very insightful. But what she has given us is the idea that focusing exclusively on the specific character of the prejudice distracts us from seeing its general characteristics and how it is capable of reproducing itself with some completely different group, some completely different, in some completely different area. Every type of personal distancing, every type of bias that we form is not only a defense against empathy with others, it is a blindness about parts of ourselves, because we are no longer then able to see the possibilities of our being much larger than what we narrowly imagine. But now let's look at this in a slightly different way. And here is what we know from conflict resolution, it seems to me. There is a fourth location of conflict. Not only does it exist internally inside of us and relationally between us and systemically around us, it also takes the general form of what I think we can think of as a kind of algorithm, a code, a set of instructions on how to process differences that are deeper than systems. And actually, these codes and algorithms tell systems how to act, how to turn in a circle. They tell relationships how to break down, and individual people how to separate themselves from others internally. And here's what I think the core of these is from a conflict resolution perspective. The core is that they reflect a zero-sum set of assumptions. That is, there is an invisible hierarchy of ranking. And fundamentally, what caste tells us is, as Isabel Wilkerson explains, is who comes first and who comes second. Who eats first and who eats second? Who gets the prime piece of food and who gets the leftovers? Who sits at the main table and who has to wait outside? Whose needs are met first for medical care and whose are met second? So the purpose of all of prejudice and bias on some level is to create a kind of ranking system. And the assumption of that ranking system is a zero-sum assumption. That is, out of 10, if I get 7, you get 3. If I get 6, you get 4. And therefore, we are pitted against each other in an adversarial relationship that is competitive and that requires us to be adversaries to one another. And of course, this is exactly what we think about when we think about power and rights-based forms of dispute resolution. But what interest-based forms of dispute resolution have to offer, and in particular what they have to offer in connection with prejudice and bias and stereotyping and discrimination, is the idea that it is possible to shift from a zero-sum set of assumptions to a non-zero-sum set of assumptions. It is possible to have a contest in which no one loses. It is possible to share the food at the table. Now, how exactly do we do that? Well, there are two things. One, we have to develop a higher order of skill, because the skills that are required to grab whatever is there first are pretty primitive and pretty simple. The skills to be able to say, here's where I belong in the hierarchy. I want as many people below me as possible and as few people above me as possible. That's the algorithm. But the algorithm for collaboration, for the non-zero sum game of collaborative negotiation, dialogue, mediation, and other aspects of what I think of as the collaborative arts and sciences, is that it is possible to share those. Now, let me give a simple example. I've used this example before. Some of you may have heard it, but it's my favorite example, so I'll repeat it. If you have heard it, please forgive me. Here's what it is. There are 3 categories of questions that I can ask everyone on this call. Category 1, who is the oldest person on this call? Who's the youngest? Who's the tallest? Who's the shortest? Who lives the closest to City Hall? Who lives the furthest away? And notice that there is now a single correct answer for everyone. We have distilled all the possible answers into one. And that one is now correct for everyone, and it takes the form of a hierarchy. We rank people from the oldest to the youngest, or from the youngest to the oldest, whichever we decide to do, tallest to shortest, shortest to tallest. And we then know exactly where we fit in that hierarchy. Category of question number, this is actually the question that is appropriate to power-based forms of decision-making. Category of question number 2, how old are you? How tall are you? Where do you live? And now notice there's a single correct answer for each person. We have shifted from one answer to everyone to one answer for each person. And this is a rights-based form of inquiry that will end up having us in a kind of internal hierarchy or relational hierarchy, perhaps outside of us, but we no longer are governed by that hierarchy. We've stepped outside of it. But now there's a question, category of question number 3. What issues are you facing at whatever age you are at? What does your height mean to you? What did it mean to you when you were growing up? What do you love about where you live? What do you not love about where you live? Those are interest-based questions. And notice there are multiple correct answers for everyone. In fact, the idea of there being a correct answer has now been completely bypassed. We don't need that anymore. It doesn't make any sense to say what's the correct answer. Whatever it feels like to you, whatever you have identified as the correct answer is the correct answer for you. And that can be a different correct answer from the one you come up with 2 minutes later. And both of them are equally correct. So that's the shift out of hierarchy. And it happens very, very simply by just asking a question that individualizes people. So now we can see that a part of the problem with bias and prejudice, and particularly with stereotyping, is that it collapses individuals into a single category. And we have thousands of ways of doing this. Here is one. A very, very simple one. And all we need to ask is this question. What is likely to be the very first word out of your mouth when you start to engage in a fight with someone else? When you are in an argument with the other person, they're right there, you're about to speak to them. What is likely to be the very first word you're going to say? And the chances are good that that word is going to be you. Okay, so the word you, said in a negative way, is an accusation. That's the form of it. And what are you going to get as a response? You're going to get counter accusation and defense automatically. No thinking required. This is going to be how you're going to respond to it. No, I didn't, and you're something worse. And now if we think about what happens if we lump people together, the pronoun is the word they. What is the form of the word they? And the answer is it's a stereotype. We have lumped people together. And what are you going to get as a result of that stereotype? The answer is prejudgment, prejudice. We will prejudge the individual members of that group based simply on the fact that they belong to that group. Now, isn't that the same for racism and sexism and homophobia and religious intolerance and ageism and everything else? We categorize people in an effort to simplify the work of trying to figure out what we're going to do in response to them. But here's the difficulty. Einstein said, make everything as simple as possible, but no simpler. And the problem is, if you have a complex problem and you offer a simple solution to a complex problem, what is going to happen? And there are two answers to that. One is you're not going to solve the problem. And the second is you're probably going to generate some conflict. So now look at it this way. We have created complex relationships, social, economic, political relationships with people. And then we have tried to solve problems within those relationships using simplistic methods, methods that are not as complex as the problem. What is more complex than another human being? So here's what we need. We need to complexify who we are to each other. We need to take race as a category, women as a category, men as a category, whatever the category might happen to be, and break it down into subcategories. Who was it? I think it was Heinrich Heine, a German poet, who said, there are no women. There is this woman and this woman and this woman. And the difficulty here is it really depends on the kind of question that we want to ask. If we want to ask who's capable of getting pregnant, the answer will be a category, women. But if we want to find out what pregnancy feels like, then we have to take a look at the experiences of individual women. And here's, of course, the important piece. Increasingly, in order to solve social, economic, political, even relational problems that exist within our society, we are now facing incredible stresses and crises. We have a healthcare crisis created by COVID. And what happens? The answer is African Americans have a greater burden of hospitalization and death as a result of COVID. We are now facing issues involving the right to an abortion. We're facing issues involving climate change and the disparate impact of climate change, of migration, of Haitians who are coming to the United States and being sent back to Haiti, of global difficulties that we need now to face, not as simplistic us versus them outcomes, but we need to face using conflict resolution techniques that are the ones that permit the kinds of questions that I'm talking about, interest-based questions, questions that are sufficiently complex so as to be able to understand the nature of the problem. So here is, I think, the basic idea. I've included in the materials a lot of kind of ideas about how to mediate issues involving prejudice, bias, stereotyping, sexual harassment claims, a variety of different things like this. And there's a lot in many of the other books that I've written. None of this is adequate. It's all just the beginning of an invitation into what I hope will be an exploration of human complexity in all of its extraordinary gorgeousness and all of its extraordinary difficulty. Now, how do we do this? Well, the answer is we have to figure out how to talk to each other. What is not in the materials is a lot of stuff on dialogue. And if you're interested in that, the book that I wrote called Politics, Dialogue, and the Evolution of Democracy is about, has a chapter about how to do those kinds of dialogues. We need those skills as well. Without them, what is going to happen is that we will gravitate towards zero-sum solutions, meaning towards power and rights-based outcomes. And instead, what we need to do is to reward and promote and encourage and invite people into conversations that could make a difference. Now, the difficulty is these can be painful. We're talking about a lot of intense emotion. And yet, there is no other way around this. Conversations in couples that are breaking up, those are painful, but they're conversations that people have to have. Every mediation is about something that is painful to somebody. And yet, we find ways as mediators of creating those conversations. And guess what? The fundamentals are no different. What is different is the need to approach these with a set of understandings that Isabel Wilkerson initiates for us and gives us an opening into. We now can see that on each of these 4 levels that I've identified, the 3 specifics and the 1 general level, that on each of these levels, there are conflict resolution techniques that we can apply that will help people have conversations that can make a difference. And in the materials, I've tried to set forth some of the questions that we can ask that can help people do this. I'd just like to give one example that comes out of a question that I was asked relatively recently by a woman who was in charge of diversity for a major university. And she was attempting to create dialogues between professors and students over issues of diversity within the university. And the professors were responding defensively and saying, you know, we don't want to be attacked by the students for being prejudiced. You know, that's essentially all that's going to happen. And so the question was, how do you open a conversation that could make a difference and invite those professors to participate in that conversation? Here's one of those questions. To the professors, do you feel stereotyped by the students? And the answer will be yes. What professor doesn't feel stereotyped by students? What student doesn't feel stereotyped by professors? We stereotype each other all the time. Every single day, we have got dozens of stereotypes going on for us. So what does that feel like to be stereotyped? Now, would you like to find out what it feels like to them to be stereotyped? And now we've got people paying attention. Here's another one. Put people together who are completely different from one another and ask them if they have ever felt biased, biases towards them, prejudged by someone in their family or their community, stereotyped by someone. And again, if people think about it, the answer will be yes. Now, share that with the other person and then talk about what that felt like for each of you and come up with a set of ideas about what it feels like. And then think about what you could do to overcome those stereotypes. Have you ever had a stereotype that you overcame? How did you do that? Do you have one now that you haven't overcome? Would you like some help in figuring out how to overcome it? Would you like to meet with the people who you've stereotyped and hear them talk to you about what has led them to do this? In other words, these are just a few of, I think, hundreds and hundreds of possible points of intervention, possible questions that we can ask. Here's the bottom line on this. I think that we have an obligation as a profession, in the first place, to take on the difficult problems of bias and prejudice and stereotyping and discrimination. We have an obligation to do this not only because we are citizens and we are impacted, all of us, by these phenomena, but also and individually as well. We live in an environment that is fraught with difficulty and danger and anger and pain, and we need to figure out how to address those issues. But also, I think there's an enormous amount that we are going to be able to learn as a result of doing this type of work about how to be more effective in shifting people out of the simple, narrow ways that they think about each other and discovering the extraordinary complexity and interesting aspects of what it feels like to become another person, what it feels like to think like that person. There's a very well-known article in the science of consciousness, which is called What Does It Feel Like to Be a Bat? And yet we ask ourselves this kind of question all the time. That's the source of empathy. How do we feel what it feels like to be in conflict, to be in their conflict, in their shoes? And it's not that we know the answer. It isn't possible for someone who is white and male and middle class to really understand what it feels like to be Black and female and poor. But what it will do is it will allow us to approach the conversation with a better attitude than the one that is defensive, that has moral rationalizations and justifications attached to selfishness and the zero-sum outcome that we have opted for. There is another way of doing it. And I think that's what our profession in general represents. So I'd like to now stop and open the conversation to anyone who would like to ask any question at all, who has difficulties or conflicts over any of the things that have been said, who wants to raise any issues or make any suggestions. And again, you're welcome to use the chat room as Victoria and Joanna have, and to look at the various chats. There's a huge amount of information in this field, and we need to get together more frequently for longer periods of time to talk it over and learn from one another. So I'm hoping that we will have a few minutes to do that now. Comments, I'll let maybe Richard can, maybe people know how to trigger the little hand raising symbol, or you can jump into the chat room, or you can just unmute yourself and jump right in.
I would ask, thank you, Ken, I appreciate it. I'd ask everybody to, and I see that we have a question right now from Kathy Porter to everyone. And so let's see here. Can you see that, Ken, or should I?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, these are references to some of the literature that has arisen as a result of what Wilkerson has written. There's a huge amount online that you can find. And you can actually find her website, which has got some very useful things in it as well. I only gave one of her quotations. Really, the whole book is just filled with tremendous amounts of insight that I find directly relate to my practice as a mediator. Really helpful stuff. Yeah, so this is very useful. There, Victoria has mentioned Ibrahim X. Kendi's book. And Johanna has recommended Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. I haven't read that one. But that sounds like an interesting book. I'm going to check that out. Thank you for that. Other ideas, other suggestions, stuff we've missed, stuff that you feel that we need to talk about.
Well, just one. Oh, go ahead, please.
One of the things I was going to mention is you talked a little bit before, very briefly, about fast and slow thinking, and that's a wonderful and fascinating concept. But part of what those two researchers, there were two Israeli psychologists actually, they talk about the evolutionary origin of bias. And I thought that was just extraordinarily interesting. That bias actually is an evolutionary function that has kind of become useless. When they developed, we were probably still hunter-gatherers or living in caves. And so some of these biases, for example, a bias toward a preference for salt or fat or sugar, are there because they drove those people to have a bias to getting as much of those things as they could when they could find them, simply because they were so rarely available. But now, because we are living in a different time and we have evolved, the biases haven't evolved. And so that same drive pushes us into really bad eating habits, you know, too much fat and too much sugar and too much salt. So the concept of an evolutionary bias, I thought, was absolutely fascinating. And it just drives us to do some things. There's their whole idea about how biases are developed and how what they are in the first four that they talked about. Similarity. A bias is because we choose something that is similar to us because we're so comfortable with it. And so there you have all the biases about prejudice and judgment that devolve from that. So I thought that work was just fascinating. It's another way of understanding bias, that it has served a function, but we don't need that function anymore.
Very nice, Maria. Thank you. Yes, my view of it is that there is a fundamental orientation in the amygdala to threat detection. And there's also a fundamental orientation arising out of, I think, living in a hunting-gathering type of environment, or certainly in the bush or the wild, towards detecting movement against a fixed background. And we can see these even in clickbait on the web, and we can see many of the biases that you're talking about resurface in advanced forms of media. But here there's another piece that needs to be added to this. Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who's his partner who didn't live for the publication of the book, identify system 1 and system 2, fast thinking and slow thinking. In my view, both of these are useful under different circumstances, and each of them has problems. So, for example, you can think of bias as also a form of preference, bias for and bias against. And you can have biases that apply to the clothing that you wear, to other kinds of food that you eat that can actually be positive. So the difficulty, I think, is understanding when the bias performs well for you and when it doesn't. And I think it's that second part that we discover is complicated by the hierarchy. So racism can perform well for people who are white in the sense that it creates a privilege or a set of privileges for them. But it performs poorly in the sense that it reduces the opportunity for collaboration, reduces empathy, reduces the ability to resolve conflicts, condemns us to living in a difficult social environment, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we can see is we need to not just say we have to eliminate all biases, we have to actually examine them, think about them, figure out what it is that works and what doesn't work about them. So I really appreciate what you're saying about the evolutionary function of biases. Thank you. I think we're now getting close to the end of our hour. Yes.
Ken, we're close, but I noticed that Kim Best had her hand up. If maybe we could take that question, please.
Kim.
Oh, thank you, Richard. Yeah, it's kind of a complicated question. As a mediator, I've always struggled. You talk about individualism, Ken, and seeing each human as themselves. But whether from an activist standpoint or a conservative standpoint, we're lumping people into groups, right? So even activists are a spokesperson for entire groups of people, which is offensive in a mediator sort of way to me. I mean, it's kind of a trigger. How do we, and then recently I was in a collective trauma summit where they identified another fight, flight, or freeze, and also a new phenomenon, which is like, it begins with an F, but basically it's
Fawn.
tribalism.
It's
it?
fawn. Fight,
Yeah.
flight, freeze, or fawn.
So finding groups that will support what you do, right? Like just so how do we begin to see the individualism on either side? Because I wonder if, I don't know, if there's a sense of someone's fighting for me, so it's okay if they miss some of it, but I don't think it's a good habit to get into, or really a good way to be an activist for someone, to represent them as a group and not individuals. So what are your thoughts on that?
It's a great question, Kim, and a really complex one. There are a couple of possible answers, and I should say that I have been now mediating a number of disputes that are exactly on point in organizations, between people, between different factions of organizations, or based on accusations of racism or sexism or homophobia or whatever the accusation may be. And the question is, how exactly do we handle these as mediators? And I think there are several approaches to this. One approach is to try to redefine what it is that people mean when they use that terminology. And in your materials, you'll find a number of different, there's one page in particular, which is about alternative ways of defining prejudice, which suggests some approaches to this. For example, one of the things that people mean is, you haven't been speaking respectfully to me. And that means that can take the form of an accusation, like you are racist, but it can also take the form of a request, as in, I would appreciate it if you would not speak to me in that way. Is that possible for you? Right? There's a second approach to it, which is to ask a question that doesn't divide people along those lines. So, for example, I worked with a political organization in the US that you've probably all heard of, that was involved in the Democratic Party campaigns to pick who was going to be the president of the United States. And their organizers, national organizers, were having meetings, And what would happen in the meetings is that people would come forward and somebody was a Bernie Sanders supporter, somebody else was an Elizabeth supporter or a Joe supporter or a Pete supporter. And as soon as you said the word Bernie or Joe or Pete or Elizabeth, all conversation stopped. So the question is, what questions could you ask that would allow that conversation to continue? Here are two. And this is two out of many that I came forward with for them to try out in their meetings. Question one, without mentioning the name of the candidate that you support, what values do you believe they stand for? Question two, how could we use those values in this conversation we're having right now to have a better conversation about what we agree on and what our differences are? And now we're talking. So I think also that was the object of some of the questions involving race and gender and class and all those various issues, which are about, here are a couple of questions. One is, what life experiences have you had that have led you to feel so passionately about this issue? I really like that question. Another question, what question would you most like the other person in this conversation to ask you right now? And now, instead of it becoming an accusation, you're saying, here's the question I would like you to ask me. Okay, that's a terrific question, because now we're going to be launching into what it is that you really deeply feel about and why that's important to you. Those are just a couple of tiny little things. And I feel once again, like I've just barely scratched the surface here. There is a gigantic ocean filled with things that we can do in those circumstances. The one thing I can tell you is the accusation, you are racist, no, I'm not, yes, you are, no, I'm not, is identical to the accusation that we hear all the time in conflict resolution. You did, no, I didn't, yes, you did, no, I didn't. And it's going to go precisely nowhere. What we want is illumination. What we want is insight. What we want is discovery. What we want is engagement, dialogue, collaboration. Not that everybody's the same. That isn't the point. The point is how wonderful that we're different. What can I learn about you and about myself as a result of just exploring those differences, feeling them, figuring them out, talking to each other. That's, I think, the project. How we get there, I think that's the problem that you're identifying and one that we have to address together. Richard.
Yes, Ken, I just, and I realize we're running short of time. I'd like to give, if there's anyone else that has a question, please, on the reaction bar down at the bottom of your screen, you can click on that and you can get the raise your hand icon and that'll come up. And unless anyone else has a question, I just have a comment. And I'm not seeing any. So my comment is this, I liked your discussion with regard to the category of questions and leading to power-based questions, right-based questions, and interest-based questions. And I think this speaks a lot to what Kim was talking about just now.
Yeah, very good.
As well. And your statement of trying to solve, we're talking about very complex systems here, and trying to solve complex problems with simple solutions leads to conflict. That was, and in that sense, if we just reduce all this down in the very simplest sophomoric terms, it's a matter of looking at interest-based solutions here to solve complex problems, as opposed to right-based or power-based. And I realize that's very sophomoric, but I think it's also pretty spot on.
Yeah.
So that's my comment.
Thank you. Thank you for the comment, Richard. I think that's very helpful. And yeah, what we want to do is stop avoiding talking about the problem. We have to address it. It's not going to be easy. And the interest-based approach is the one that gives us the orientation that will allow us to explore these deeper areas. That's my hope. So I want to encourage you to continue the conversation, to talk to people that you have differences with, to address it through questions. And this third category of questions rather than the simplistic judgmental kind.
Right.
Thank you for that, Richard.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ken, and thank you very much for your time today and for your insight as always. Yes, as always, just such a pleasure to be in the room with you,
Thank you.
even though it's virtual. It's just absolutely fabulous. And with that, I will just tell you thank you again, and to everybody that's in the audience, please just keep in mind we have our annual conference coming up on November 12th and 13th. We have an awards dinner where we will be, in fact, awarding the Cloke Millen Peacemaker of the Year Award to Lee J. Berman. And I know that Ken will be involved in that in some way, shape, or form. And so there'll be more to come on that. Please keep your eye on our website for the event. And we just look forward to seeing you all there. And Ken, thank you again so much. It's just such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.